December 18th, 1942. The wind scraped across the ruins of what used to be a textile factory on the western edge of Stalingrad like a blade against bone. I pressed my back against a section of collapsed concrete wall, feeling the cold seep through 3 layers of stolen clothing, a dead Soviet's greatcoat over my Wehrmacht tunic, wrapped with strips of burlap I'd torn from grain sacks. My name is Klaus Bergman, and I was 23 years old, though I felt decades older. The cold wasn't just temperature, it was a presence. It lived in your joints, turned your fingers into wooden stubs, made your teeth ache, even when your jaw was clenched shut. I'd stopped feeling my toes 4 days ago. That scared me more than the Russian snipers. Through a gap in the rubble, I could see across 30 meters of no man's land to the Soviet positions, another broken factory wall, blackened by fire, pockmarked by artillery. Somewhere in that darkness, Russian soldiers huddled just like us, probably just as cold, just as hungry, just as terrified of the next mortar round that would decide who lived and who became another frozen corpse beneath the snow. My hands shook as I tried to light a cigarette. Not from fear, though God knows there was plenty of that, but from the cold and from hunger that had become a constant companion. The cigarette was my last one, saved for 3 days, and the tobacco was so dry it crumbled when I touched it. I gave up, tucking it back into my breast pocket with fingers that barely responded to my brain's commands. Bergman. The whisper came from my left. Corporal Ernst Fischer crawled along the rubble line, his face so covered in grime and frostbite that only his eyes showed any life. Lieutenant wants you at the command post. What for? Didn't say. Just go. I crawled backward, staying low, my rifle dragging through snow mixed with brick dust and things I didn't want to identify. The command post was 15 meters back, a basement entrance covered with a tattered canvas tarp, now stiff with ice. I slid through the gap, welcomed by darkness that somehow felt warmer than the world above. Lieutenant Werner Hoffman sat on an upturned ammunition crate, a candle stub providing the only light. His face was gaunt, cheekbones sharp enough to cast shadows. He'd been a schoolteacher before the war, taught literature in Munich. Now he commanded 19 men, all that remained of our company of 147. Bergman, he said, his voice hoarse, you speak Russian. Some, sir. My mother was Ukrainian. She taught me when I was young. Good enough. He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, stained with something dark. This morning, before dawn, the Russians put up a white flag. Lasted maybe 10 seconds before someone, ours or theirs, doesn't matter, put a bullet through it. But before it fell, someone threw this across. Corporal Hines retrieved it before his position took a mortar hit. He handed me the paper, in crude Cyrillic, written with what looked like charcoal. 5 minutes, noon. Collect the dead. No shooting. Bury them before the rats. My throat tightened. We'd all seen what happened to bodies left in no man's land. The rats had grown fat and fearless. What do you think, sir? Hoffman stared at the candle flame. I think they're as tired as we are. I think they have bodies out there too. Sons, brothers, fathers. He looked up at me, and I saw something I hadn't seen in weeks: humanity behind the exhaustion. I think for 5 minutes we can remember we're men, not animals. And if it's a trap, then we die 5 minutes sooner than we would have anyway. He stood, his joints cracking audibly. But I don't think it is. Tell the men. Noon. 5 minutes. Nobody fires unless fired upon. Understood. Yes, sir. I spent the next hour crawling from position to position, delivering the impossible news. Each man reacted differently. Private Georg Weber, A. Baker's son from Stuttgart, laughed a harsh, broken sound. They want to help us? The same bastards who were shelling us this morning? Not help, I corrected. A truce. 5 minutes to collect our dead. And theirs? And theirs. He went quiet, staring at his hands. His best friend Paul had been killed 2 days ago, his body lying maybe 20 meters out, half buried in snow. We'd tried to retrieve him, but Russian machine gun fire drove us back. Paul's frozen hand still pointed toward our lines like he was reaching for home. 5 minutes, Weber whispered. God help us. At the northern position, I found Sergeant Otto Kessler, our oldest soldier at 41. He'd fought in the First War, carried shrapnel in his hip that made him limp. When I told him about the ceasefire, he closed his eyes and nodded slowly. I've seen this before, he said. Christmas 1914, Western Front. The British and Germans stopped fighting, sang carols, and buried their dead together. The generals were furious. He opened his eyes. By New Year, we were killing each other again. But for those few hours, we remembered. We remembered Bergman. Remember what? That the man trying to kill you is probably a good man. That war is the crime, not the soldier. I had no response to that. The philosophy felt too large for my frozen, half-starved brain to process. By the time I'd reached every position, it was 11:30. The pale winter sun hung low in the sky, offering no warmth, only weak gray light that made the ruins look like a painting of hell. I returned to my position, checked my rifle habit, nothing more, and waited. The minutes crawled. Time became elastic, stretched by anxiety and anticipation. What would they look like, these Russians? Would they be monsters, the Asiatic hordes our propaganda depicted? Or would they be like Georg, like Otto, like me boys pretending to be soldiers, playing at war until war became real and consumed everything? At 11:58, Lieutenant Hoffman emerged from the command post. He held a white cloth someone's shirt, I think attached to a broken rifle barrel. He planted it in the rubble, and it hung limp in the still air. 2 minutes. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, hear the breathing of Fisher beside me, hear the distant rumble of artillery from the city center, where the real battle, the one that mattered to generals and history books, continued without pause. 1 minute. A figure appeared on the Soviet side. Then another. They weren't pointing weapons, they were just standing, waiting. The factory whistle, broken since October, somehow chose this moment to let out a weak, dying wail. Maybe it was the wind passing through shattered metal. Maybe it was God's sense of timing. Noon. The silence that followed was more profound than any I'd ever experienced. Not the absence of sound. Artillery still rumbled in the distance, wind still moaned through broken structures, but the absence of hostility, the sudden vacuum where violence had lived for so long. Lieutenant Hoffman stepped out first. He moved slowly, hands visible, white flag still planted behind him. He took 5 steps into no man's land and stopped. From the Soviet side, an officer emerged. Even from 30 meters, I could see he was young, maybe younger than me. He wore a fur shapka and a greatcoat that had once been tan, but was now stained nearly black. He also stopped, matching Hoffman's distance. For 10 seconds, the two officers simply looked at each other. Then, simultaneously, they nodded. That nod broke the spell. Georg Weber was the first of our men to move. He scrambled over the rubble, running in a crouch toward the place where Paul's body lay. From the Soviet side, 2 soldiers moved toward their own dead. I could see the bodies now, 3 of them, frozen in the positions where they'd fallen. I climbed over our barricade, my legs shaking from cold or fear or relief, I couldn't tell. The no man's land I'd stared at for weeks, that had existed only as a killing ground in my mind, was now just ground. Cratered, burned, littered with debris and the detritus of war, but traversable. Humans. A Russian soldier, maybe 40 years old with a thick black beard, was struggling to lift one of his comrades. The body was frozen, solid, arms locked in a defensive position. I hesitated, then moved to help. He looked at me, really looked at me, eye to eye, and for a moment I thought he might shoot me, refuse my help, spit in my face. Instead, he nodded. Together, we lifted the frozen corpse. The dead Soviet was young, maybe 19, his face peaceful beneath a layer of frost. The older Russian said something in his language. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the tone. This boy should be home with his mother. Da, I said, one of the few Russian words I knew. Yes. We carried the body toward the Soviet lines. Another Russian, a boy even younger than the corpse we carried, met us halfway and took my place. As I turned back, I saw the scene that I know will haunt me until I die. Across 30 meters of devastated ground, German and Soviet soldiers moved among the dead and dying like mourners at a vast frozen cemetery. There was no hatred in their movements, no triumph or anger, just exhaustion and grief. Georg had reached Paul. He knelt beside his friend's body, tried to close Paul's eyes, but they were frozen open, staring at nothing. Georg's shoulders shook with sobs he'd been holding back for 2 days. A Soviet soldier, passing nearby with his own burden, paused. He reached into his coat and pulled out something, a small wooden cross, crudely carved. He placed it in the snow beside Paul's body, met Georg's eyes, and moved on. Near the center of no man's land, Lieutenant Hoffman and the Soviet officer stood together, not speaking, neither spoke the other's language, but sharing a cigarette the Russian had produced. They passed it back and forth in silence, their breath mingling with the smoke. 2 men who would try to kill each other again. I checked my watch. 3 minutes. I moved toward another German body, one I didn't recognize. He wore an artillery insignia. His body had been out here longer, maybe a week, and the rats had gotten to him. His face was mostly gone. I felt my stomach turn, forcing the bile back down. Someone's son, someone's brother. As I bent to grab his feet, a Russian soldier appeared opposite me, reaching for the shoulders. He was thin, even thinner than me, with a scar running from his ear to his chin. He said something in Russian. I shook my head. German, I said. Deutscher. He nodded, repeated my gesture toward the body. Together? Together, I agreed. We carried the faceless German toward our lines. Halfway there, the Russian stumbled, his weakness obvious. I caught him, steadied him, and for just a second, his hand gripped my shoulder in what might have been gratitude. At our lines, Sergeant Kessler took the body from us. The Russian soldier, I wished I knew his name, met my eyes one last time. He was maybe 25, with deep-set eyes that looked ancient. He said something, a single word I didn't understand, then turned and walked back toward his lines. I stood there, watching him go, and thought, in another life, we might have been friends. The thought made my chest tighten. 4 minutes had passed. I could see men on both sides becoming aware of the time, their movements growing more urgent. We weren't done, there were still bodies out there, still men who deserved burial, but the clock was our master now. I moved toward one more figure, a German soldier lying face down near a shell crater. As I approached, I realized with sick certainty that I knew him. Corporal Heinz, the same Heinz who'd retrieved the Russian note, who'd been killed by a mortar this morning. His back was shredded, his uniform torn open by shrapnel. I knelt beside him, tried to roll him over gently, and nearly screamed when his eyes opened. He was alive, barely. His lips moved, forming words with no sound. Blood frozen at the edges, still liquid at the center, pooled beneath him. He'd been lying here for hours, dying by inches in the cold. Heinz, I breathed. Hold on, I've got you. I tried to lift him, but he was dead weight, his body not responding to whatever remained of his consciousness. I looked around desperately. 50 meters back, our lines. 30 meters to the Soviet position. Where was the help? A shadow fell across me. The Russian officer, the one who'd been sharing a cigarette with Hoffman, stood above us. He looked at Heinz, at me, and I saw the calculation in his eyes. This wasn't a corpse. This was a living enemy soldier. Please, I said in German, then tried Russian. Pожалуйста. Please. The officer's jaw tightened. For 3 heartbeats, I thought he would refuse, would shoot us both, would prove that the 5 minutes had been a lie all along. Then he knelt, grabbed Heinz's other arm, and together we lifted. Heinz groaned, the first sound he'd made as we carried him toward our lines. Each step was agony. He was heavier than the frozen corpses, his body limp and uncooperative. The Russian officer's face was set in grim determination, his breath coming in short gasps. "Spasibo," I panted. "Thank you." He didn't respond, just kept moving. We were 10 meters from our lines when Lieutenant Hoffman's voice cracked across the stillness. 30 seconds. The Russian officer heard it too, understood the urgency, even if he didn't speak German. We moved faster, half running, half stumbling. Other men, ours and theirs, were sprinting now, abandoning the dead they'd been collecting, racing back to their positions before the clock struck 0, and the war resumed. We reached our barricade with seconds to spare. Sergeant Kessler and Private Weber grabbed Heinz, pulled him over the rubble. The Russian officer released his grip, stepped back, his eyes meeting mine one final time. "Why?" I asked, the word escaping before I could stop it. He understood, even if he didn't understand the language. He tapped his chest, over his heart, then pointed at Heinz. "Because he's human. Because it matters." Then he turned and ran toward his lines. 5 minutes were up. The shooting started again at 12:06. A single rifle crack from somewhere north of us, then answering fire from the Soviet side, then the steady percussion of machine guns and mortars resuming their ancient conversation. We dragged Heinz into the command post. He was unconscious now, his breathing shallow and wet. Lieutenant Hoffman examined the wounds, and I saw the hopelessness in his eyes. Heinz needed a field hospital, surgery, blood transfusions, none of which existed in our frozen corner of hell. "Make him comfortable," Hoffman said quietly. Heinz died 20 minutes later, surrounded by men who'd risked everything to bring him home. His last word was, "Mutti." Mother. I sat in the darkness afterward, my back against the frozen wall, and tried to make sense of what had happened. For 5 minutes, the war had stopped. Not ended, stopped. Like someone had pressed pause on a film reel. We'd been men again, not soldiers. We'd helped each other, respected each other's dead, shared cigarettes and silent acknowledgement of our common suffering, and then the clock ran out, and we went back to trying to kill each other. That night, it snowed. Heavy, wet flakes that covered the ruins turned the battlefield into something almost beautiful, almost peaceful. I stared out at no man's land, now pristine white, and tried to remember which crater the Russian officer had stood beside, which patch of ground Weber had knelt on, which shadow had been the man with the scar who'd helped me carry the faceless artilleryman. The snow erased it all. "Do you think they'll remember?" Private Weber asked. He'd been staring out at the same scene, his mind probably following the same paths as mine. "The Russians?" "Yes. Do you think they'll remember that for 5 minutes we were just men?" I thought about the officer who'd helped carry Heinz, about the old soldier who'd placed a cross by Paul's body, about the scarred man who'd stumbled and let me catch him. "I think they will," I said. "I think they have to. Otherwise, what's the point of any of this?" Weber was quiet for a long time. Then, "There is no point. That's the whole problem." He was right, of course, but he was also wrong. Because somewhere in the Soviet lines, I knew, a Russian soldier was having the same conversation, wondering if we remembered, hoping that those 5 minutes had meant something. 3 days later, our unit was pulled back from Stalingrad. We'd been there for 79 days. Of the 147 men who'd entered the city, 19 walked out. Lieutenant Hoffman wasn't among them. A sniper got him on December 21st. Sergeant Kessler made it out, only to die of pneumonia in a field hospital 2 weeks later. Georg Weber survived the war, went home to Stuttgart, and reopened his father's bakery. I survived too, though survived is a complicated word. My body made it through. My mind took longer. For years after the war, I tried to find out who that Russian officer was. I wrote letters to Soviet veteran organizations, described the 5 minutes of ceasefire, asked if anyone remembered December 18, 1942. I never got an answer. Maybe the letters never reached anyone. Maybe the officer died in Stalingrad, like so many others. Maybe he survived and wanted to forget. I never forgot. I still haven't, 63 years later. I still see him sometimes, in dreams. Still see him kneeling beside Heinz, making the choice to help an enemy because it was the human thing to do. Still see his eyes in that final moment when he tapped his chest and reminded me that beneath the uniforms and the ideology and the hatred, we were all just trying to survive, all just hoping to make it home. The war tried to make us into animals. For 5 minutes, we refused. That's the story. That's what I want people to remember. Not the battles or the strategy or which side won which hill, but the 5 minutes when the war stopped and we remembered who we were. It happened. I was there. And it mattered. It still matters.